Okay, so in this part we're going to be talking about linting and exactly what this is and why it's best to go ahead and lint your code however you can to just ensure that the quality of it is up to standards. So we're going to look at a website called JSLint, which basically allows you to paste in code and it'll return suggestions of how you can improve your code, and you'll have a pass or a fail here. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working with this source code here, and it's a very short piece of functionality. You've got the first declaration here is applying an empty object to this app variable, and we've got two methods here on this object, add and increment. So these both do two completely different things. The first one takes a parameter or two parameters, and simply adds them together and returns the result. The second method here takes one number and increments it and returns the result. And then on the line down here, we're just sort of testing this functionality out. So if we go ahead and actually see what this looks like in the browser, you can see that we get the result 16 returned. So this is from adding 5 and 11 using the add method up here. If we were to go ahead and use the increment method, we'll just demonstrate how that works. So let's just pass 5 into there, and when we refresh, we should get 6 returned, but we want to return plus number, like so. So now that we've got the functionality explained, let's go ahead and copy and paste this into a quality check known as linting. And I suppose the original is jslint.com, which was created by Douglas Crockford, and this basically allows you to paste in your source code into this area, hit JSLint. There are various other options which we'll speak about in just a moment, including this bit down here. What we can do is go ahead and just paste, and this is actually going to generate errors as it stands. So let's take a look at what they are. Now the first thing that we've got here is that it's stopped at 63%, and it's got an unexpected app. You might wonder why that is when the functionality within our actual browser works. We don't get any JavaScript errors, we don't see any errors in the console or anything like that. So why do we have an unexpected app here? Here on line 14. The reason being, and at the start of this video you probably saw that there was a semicolon on the end of this line. That is probably a standard that should be followed, because technically we've done it here, so why wouldn't we do it down here? So we have a similar deal going on. So if we go ahead and correct that mistake, because our code has already scanned 63% through, let's go ahead and paste this in, hit JSLint, and we get a few more errors here. So this one is a little bit odd. We'll go ahead and talk about this one in just a moment. But the unexpected console error here doesn't make too much sense, in terms of this working. But again, it's for the same reason that we have a semicolon at the end of here. So if we go ahead and just copy and paste this, we'll go through the last error here, and then we'll also look at some other errors that we could possibly get. So the only error that we've got back now is an unexpected double plus sign, the operator to increment a number by 1. So why is it unexpected? Well, the problem here is that JSLint recommends that you don't use ++ either at the start or at the end of a variable. It recommends instead, mainly for sort of code readability and to understand code, is to say return number, or if you're assigning this to a variable, whatever, equals the original value or original variable plus, and then whatever number that you need to increment by. And I suppose this does make sense, because you can automatically see here that 1 is being added to this number, and if this did need to change to 2, it can just easily be changed like so. So let's go ahead and just copy and paste this in with that change, and we'll see that that error should go. And okay. So I think what's happened here is we have this being returned on the same sort of line. So I mean, I guess it would probably be more correct to say this. So if we were to cut this, paste this here, and then return number. The problem here is that it's the assignment operator that's unexpected after this return. So let's go ahead and paste this back in and see if we have any problems. And the thing with this, with JSLint, is that it does do a very thorough check of your application. So you know, you may find that if you've written a lot of code, it does take a while for it, you actually to validate it all as okay. And you can see here that that's the case now. We don't have any errors. So let's take a look at some circumstances where we might find ourselves, getting errors here when we maybe shouldn't. So for example, if I was to go ahead and use exactly the same code, and I removed, let's say, or let's create an interval. So let's go ahead and say app.interval equals function, and then we will go ahead and just say set interval and we'll do that every second. So we're just going to create an infinite interval here every second. It will output 1 to the console. Now we're using a function here, and technically we're using a sort of function set here from this sort of console object, which is built into the browser. Now what's going to happen is, by default, when you land on JSLint, this area here will probably be empty. Okay, mine seemed to have remembered that I have these from last time. But if I go ahead and paste this in, look at the errors that we get. And these might confuse you, because if you're using methods and accessing functions like setInterval or console, the problems we get here is that we have the fact that it wasn't defined. So it's telling us that setInterval hasn't been defined. Now it has, because it's part of JavaScript's function set, and console is part of the browser that we can use to actually output stuff to the console. So what we need to do is we need to take anything that gives this error, and be careful, because sometimes you can use things before they're defined. So for example, if I were to go ahead and I were to say app.subtract, for example, and then choose 2 numbers, you'll notice we'll get a very similar error. So if we paste this in, oh, okay. So if I was to just call maybe subtract, might make it easier to demonstrate. So we get this subtract was used before it was defined also. So with this aside, how do we get rid of the errors like this when we do know that these have already been defined? Well, it's easy. We just add them down here to the predefined global variables, and that can be the case for any variables at all. And you might find this is the case as well when you're working with libraries like jQuery as well. You're not going to have jQuery's functionality available to you when you go ahead and paste in your code, because jQuery is almost always loaded as an external library. So what you want to do is go ahead and load in jQuery as a predefined variable, and you might need to play around with this for a while. So now that we've looked at pasting in an example and sort of clearing up some of the errors, we get a function report here, which is quite nice as well. But down here are some options, so we can tolerate certain things. And at the moment, by default, I have tolerate messy white space on, and I've got tolerate missing use strict pragma on as well, which is a pragma that you would define up here, which would just be use strict. So we'll ignore that one for now, but what we will do is we'll untolerate messy white space, and we'll see what happens here. So when I hit JSLint, you see that we've got a whole load of errors here, a massive load of errors. So that's why I tend to say tolerate messy white space on, because I don't you know, personally, I'm not bothered about, you know, using spaces instead of tabs. But if you did want to follow all of this, you know, you would end up with code that completely validates to this. And JSLint is something that's used, you know, across, you know, many developers. It's not just a website. It's you know, this is written in JavaScript. You can get the source code for this. You can also go ahead and get this built into sort of you know, if you have a workflow, say in Grunt or something like that, you can get apps that will or tasks that will run and lint your code before they're put into production or onto a development server. So this is a really useful thing to bear in mind when you're working in JavaScript, so you can increase the quality of your code. So for now, with what we've written, if we were to tolerate messy white space and lint this code, we don't have any errors. So this is satisfied lint's expectations of what code should be. But if you are developing, especially if you're a new developer, it's best to get into good habits by actually linting your code as you're developing, and then you can go ahead and actually, you know, learn to write clean, you know, nice code rather than, you know, having to relearn to do it all again. So yeah, that's JSLint and what it does. And you know, we've looked at tidying up some code and looked at, you know, some of the options, and notably this, which will define you know, global variables that are already in your application.